So we're continuing Galatians. Last week we did kind of a Galatians overview, and the interesting thing to think about was this idea of, like, if you can think about apartheid or something like that. I thought this was the best kind of example of Galatians. So you remember apartheid back in the 70s, and if someone built like a clinic or something like that, it would be that everyone, no matter who you were, was able to come to this clinic. But then that person had to go away for whatever reason that started it, and someone else came, well, what we actually should be doing is we should have like two different doors, and two different sides of the clinic. And what that original person that created the clinic, what they would say is they come back. And that's kind of the idea that's going on in Galatians, is that Paul has set up this church in the Galatia region, which is kind of like Turkey, Asia Minor, it's called, and Syria kind of idea going on. And he's created this church, and Paul's doing everything, creates these churches, and then goes on to other places, usually prison, and then he hears about what's going on in the church, and that there's people that, according to Paul, are bamboozling them, and to really taking them down a different route. So we're going to see if we can get through chapter 1 today. We'll see how that goes. And as we kind of walk slowly through this, and the thing to look for is what sounds familiar, because we have to remember why the letter was being written. Paul's planted this church. There's people that have come into this church. The reason why I think that they are making a big deal out of like changing what Paul had kind of set up is because of power. Do I need to move any of this stuff? Yeah, all right. Paul accuses these people of like kind of power seeking, that they are pastors or priests or something like that are kind of like just looking for kind of power. And Paul now is writing back to them, going like, hey, you're starting to exclude yourself. You're starting to exclude other people from the kingdom of God. Let's remember what this is about. And it's important to remember that Paul is writing a response back to that church. That this isn't being written in a vacuum. He's probably referencing sermons, theological ideas that he was talking as he was planting that church. So he's going back because this is a personal letter. So it's like we're reading the diary type of thing. And sometimes we think like these epistles are like, oh, it's just written to the broader. Well, the whole thing behind the epistles is they're kind of personal letters to these groups of people. But the church was like, oh, hey, these are actually pretty good. We're encouraging. So like they would send it off. Like, and so that's why we still have it. So, and you could still see that same thing happening. Like, I think back earlier, like decades earlier, people would like share like Billy Graham sermons, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Very similar idea to how the epistles would have gotten shared around. They would have copied them and things like that. And this isn't the full collective of what Paul wrote. This is just the stuff that was decent enough for us to pass on. And that was.
I remember Billy Graham had a terrific influence on me.
Oh, did he?
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think Billy Graham had a big influence on everyone in your guys' generation. And so like that's.
I was just 15, 16.
Yeah. Yeah. Like that's, you guys are, oh, hello, Pam. Grab a chair out of there and slide it in. We'll set her up next. Well, here we can.
Come this way. Give her.
Yeah.
I didn't want to make her go in the corner. Come on in. Come on in.
Come on in.
Water's fine.
Excellent. All right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to listen to the first chapter, and then we will talk about it and kind of slowly go through it. So I forgot to. There's these things. If anyone would like to reference an outline. Outline of the book.
I have it.
Yeah.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay. And you could take that home if you want. It's just a printout. So, all right. So here we go. We'll listen to the first chapter. Here we go.
Paul, an apostle not from men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead, and all the brethren who are with me. To the churches of Galatia, grace to you and peace from God the Father and our Lord Jesus Christ, who gave himself for our sins, that he might deliver us from this present evil age, according to the will of our God and Father, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. I marvel that you are turning away so soon from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel, which is not another. But there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we, or an angel from heaven, preach any other gospel to you than what we have preached to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone preaches any other gospel to you than what you have received, let him be accursed. For do I now persuade men or God? Or do I seek to please men? For if I still pleased men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. But I make known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles. I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter, and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Now concerning the things which I write to you, indeed before God I do not lie. Afterward I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was unknown by face to the churches of Judea which were in Christ. But they were hearing only, he who formerly persecuted us now preaches the faith which you once tried to destroy. And they glorified God in me.
Okay. The idea kind of actually continues there, but that's kind of the way the whole thing kind of works. Okay, so let's kind of walk through this. So the big thing with there's a lot of newer people in here, so that's exciting. The big thing that I think is the biggest help in studying the Bible is allowing yourself to make connections. Because that's what Paul's doing. He's making connections to other sermons of his, but he's also making connections to other stories, both in the Old Testament and stuff that we know that happened in his life, like from Acts, And look, the Gospels do this just constantly, and like they just constantly doing that. And so be looking through that as we kind of slowly are reading through this. We'll kind of go verse by verse as we go through. If you have any ideas or anything kind of steps out to you, say it. Like, discussion's better than just me talking. I think I figured out how to teach the Gospels pretty well, but the epistles are a different matter. So we'll see how we go. We'll see how we go. All right. So Paul just does his greeting in the first 5 verses here. He goes, and he's doing things right off the bat to kind of establish who he is. Like Paul, an apostle, which means apostle means sent one that has been sent. So like we've been talking in the sermon series a lot right now. Jesus breathes on them in that locked room, and he goes, "As the Father has sent me, so I'm sending you." That makes them kind of an apostle, right? Like a sent out one. So he's like an apostle, and he says in establishing is not from men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ, and God the Father has raised him from the dead. We're going to get back to that later, but Paul says that his sending outness came from Christ himself, which is the Damascus Road experience. Right. So that's kind of that. Yeah, that's kind of that starting off right in the beginning here. And to all the brethren who are with me, to the churches in Galatia, so writing to who this is for. So grace to you and peace from God our Father and Lord Jesus Christ, who gave himself for our sins, that he might deliver us from this present evil age, according to the will of our God and Father, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. I think it's interesting how he adds in this one, who might deliver us from this present evil age. I think he's just slightly getting into what his topic is going to be about. Like that. That's because Paul is upset in this letter. And Paul is upset in this letter. And if you want to read anything fiery from Luther, Martin Luther's best writings is when he's upset. And Luther, when he was being sued by, and I think it was when he was dealing with the diet of worms stuff, he wrote his commentary on Galatians. And so he really connects some of the stuff that he's going through with the Catholic Church trying to basically kill him. Like for a long time there, Luther was in house arrest. And the reason why, and the house arrest probably saved his life, because the Catholic Church was probably trying to kill him during that time. Because you gotta remember, the Catholic Church was a big political head right now, and Luther was stirring the pot with that. So if you want to read something fiery, Luther's commentary on Galatians is pretty good. I've not read it since seminary. I just have memories of it, so I probably should read it, but over there. But yeah, he yells a lot, calls a lot of people farts, and good Luther stuff like that. So, but that present evil age, I think he's going in there, and I think Paul, and this is all Chris Escher, but that Paul is connecting that present evil age to this ease of deception. This ease of deception that he's established this church, and now he has people that are, to quote him in just a few verses, abandoning the gospel that he taught. Okay, so that's kind of the beginning. Like, did anyone have anything before we go on?
Line 7.
Verse 7.
Yes.
Yeah, all right. I haven't read that yet, but that's.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Okay. Like that's like they. All right. I'm just reigning in the class. I will be in control. Like that's so. So verse 6, and look at how he begins this. So he's got that nice little intro, and then like all the sugar has gone away. Like, I marvel that you are turning away so soon from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel. Like this, that's like just sugar's gone. Like just I marvel at the beginning. Do the other translations say anything phenomenally different than that?
Yeah, I'm astonished.
Okay, astonished.
Quickly deserting the one who called you.
Okay, yeah. Deserting the one who called you. Like that's, does it use the grace of Christ language there? Does it use that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's see here. I like that's. Look how fancy I got. I got the Greek here. Like that. That's let's see. What verse is that? Is that 6?
6.
So yeah.
I like astonished.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
So let's see here.
German.
Yeah. 5. There it is. So for Christ, neither circumcision. No, hold on. Oh, this is chapter 5. Ha.
Well, no.
Chapter.
1.
Sorry, Lee. I know you can't see this. I don't think it's all that important to actually see, but I just wanted to look at, make sure that the grace of Christ. So that grace of Christ word, I think, is important there, because he's establishing what they have abandoned. Right there, he's like, I'm so astonished that you have abandoned grace, and not like Grace Lutheran Church. That's just a name, but that you've abandoned grace. And we're going to see as we continue through Galatians that he's talking about how they're running after the law again, running after the law. And he's saying right from the bat, he's like, I'm astonished that you've abandoned grace. Like, and I think he's also connecting that to that present evil age idea that I think we still struggle under that we're so quick to abandon grace and start looking after ways that the law can save us, because we love to be our own gods and define what our own paths of salvation are. Right. Like, so that's, and I think he starts going after that. And then here's Lee's favorite verse 7, which is not another, but there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. So what did you want to say about that, Lee?
That he's clarifying that there is no interpretation here. It's through the grace of Christ, and that's it.
Okay.
And basically, anybody who tells you differently is lying.
Yeah.
He hits you with it from the beginning. Then I shouldn't say this, but then he goes on to explain further.
Yeah. And so he continues to say, so that grace of Christ, a different gospel, which is not another, but there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ, like this. And this is where, it's, I think we could see ourselves in it. We can see situations that we have found ourselves in it, where we maybe have perverted the gospel of Christ to quote that Mark study we did, to search for our own power and ability. Because we love to have power and ability over people, right? It's like, this is how you have to live. This is how you have to be, right? And so and then he says that there's some that are causing trouble, basically, because they want to pervert the gospel of Christ. And I think that's that power interplay that he's doing. Now, Paul is very careful here, but he's trying to establish his own, we'll call it authority, but power. We'll just use that word because I love that word, power. So he's careful to do it, how he does it. He's trying not to do it to strike down at people, but yeah. So that perversion of the gospel of Christ, and there's people that are causing trouble and are perverting the gospel of Christ. So verse 8, but even if we or an angel from heaven preach another gospel to you than the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. And we'll continue in 9. It's the same phrase again. As we have said before, so I say it again. If anyone preaches another gospel to you than the one you have received, let him be accursed. Like, again, the sugar is gone. The sugar is gone. And it's this idea. He's like, even if it all looks holy and good, looks like the angels are singing, if it doesn't center around what we'll say is the grace of Christ, then like, let that person be accursed. Like that's strong language. Like that's not, he's not just like slipping it in through the side, right? Like that's like he's not doing that at all. And so
Pounding the table with words.
yeah, he is. And that's a big deal. Like he's making a strong deal out of that, because I think he sees that it's serious. Because there's this inkling inside of us, and we're going to talk about this over and over again, to look to the law, and we'll look at law as how as Christians define it. This isn't an anti-Judaism thing. It's a looking for a set of boundaries that's going to save us thing. You know, that's what the law is. That's how Christians define the law. And we need to be careful that, because it's easy to read Galatians, because Paul wasn't trying to do this, and become kind of anti-Jewish and things like that. It's very, very easy to do that. He's not talking about that. He's talking about there are deceivers in you that are causing problems, and they're doing it, as we'll see later on in the letter, they're doing it for their own power and their own benefit. Like that. And he's saying, like, even if it looks holy and good, but it's not the grace of Christ, let him be accursed. And I think we have to evaluate ourselves, where it's like, okay, you know, am I saved by the grace of Christ? And then we got test number 2. Is my neighbor who mows the lawn at 9:30 at night or something like that, you know, like is he saved by the grace of Christ? Because if he's saved by needing to mow the lawn at a normal time, then in your mind, you're not saved by the grace of Christ either. Like that's so, like you're just saying that you have to mow your lawn at the right times. And we all know I'm not talking about mowing lawns. You know, like that's, you got to live a life like I did. And we'll see that. So I think it's interesting. He devotes 2 whole sentences to say the same thing. That it's just wrong, right? And I have a feeling everyone that was reading this in Galatian churches, they knew exactly who he was talking about. And these people were probably loved too. But you got to remember that the people that were there speaking to them, convincing them of these other ways, were probably great preachers, and people loved them. I've talked about it before. If you guys know what podcasts are, is basically all I listen to. What are you laughing at?
I'm wondering, Sarah.
Yeah. There was a and we'll get a little personal every now and then, because my previous situation, I kind of resonate strongly with what Paul is saying in my previous church, because a lot of this stuff kind of happened. And one of the reasons why all that happened is there was a pastor that kind of started having this very national notoriety. They got very popular. His name is Mark Driscoll. He was in Seattle at the time. You've heard me talk about it before, probably. Huge church, like 25,000 a weekend type of thing in Seattle, you know, and very abusive leader though. And he was very much set up this whole thing where it's like, you got to do this in order to be living a good life, and just clink, 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 clink. And I started seeing in the Christian purview around that same time, that those thinkings and stuff like that were starting to gain sway inside of the church that I was at, but also my friends' churches all around. Like, this guy had such influence that people were listening to him outside of that. And so that's it. But there's a podcast called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. The name of the church was Mars Hill. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating because this church, 25,000, 23,000 a weekend, multiple locations in Seattle area, it within a matter of 3 months went from those numbers to not existing. You know, so it was, and what a lot of people think, there's like this modern deconstructionist movement inside the church. Have you heard about this? So a lot of people are like deconstructing their faith and kind of walking away from things and all that stuff. A lot of scholars think that it's actually because of Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll, because he had gained so much notoriety and had such a message of confidence of, he called it the grace of Christ, but it was all law-based. It's like, you got to live this way, you got to do these things. And so many people enjoyed it, and they watched it all blow up. And so all of a sudden their faith blew up. And it affected everything. And it has affected our modern notion here, you know, and around us in this day. But this, yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask the question, if you have where it says the grace of Christ, how else, what other ways is it written in your books when they speak of the grace of Christ that Paul's using? Is it always set? Does he always use that phrase, like grace of Christ?
I don't know. No. And I think, I'm pretty sure that he will explain it more
As we go.
as we go. In Galatians, I think he's hitting right here at the beginning. I think he's causing us to really look towards things that he said earlier and all that stuff. Do you want to clarify your question anymore?
Well, just that I think that's where some people get lost with Galatians, is the grace of, what is Paul trying to say? It's the grace of Christ, not like you're saying the old laws. You're not going by the old laws anymore. We're going by the grace of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
It is different.
Yeah.
There's a why going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Changing. I, like you, had a similar, I had an incident in a church that I was a member of.
Yeah.
That was following and believed dearly in what they were following is in the law. Yeah. But they had lost the grace of Christ in the teaching. Yeah. Enough that I had to leave. I could never explain to him why. And that's what I'm trying to get.
And that's what's tricky a lot of times, because it looks like righteousness. Yeah. It looks like, and a lot of times people's ambitions towards it are righteousness. You know, they want to be good people. Like, it's not like, and that's why it's like a wolf in sheep's clothing, because it's, and I think that's when he says that, you know, even if an angel in heaven preaches this to you, you know, I think that's kind of a cue, because a lot of times it looks like righteousness, and it's hard to say. It's like, hey, be careful of that, because it looks like you're trying, when you're saying that, like you're trying to go against righteousness.
Right. And if you put yourself in the shoes of this man, who started this church and loves these people, and he comes back to these, the people he left in charge, they're no dummies. They follow the laws. So it's a terrifying thought that you're going to lose all these loved ones to the devil.
And so that's, I mean, that's, he's just like, oh my goodness. Right. So let's keep on going. So for, do I now persuade men or God, or do I seek to please men? Or for, if I still pleased men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. Now, this is a weird phrasing, weird thing here. And what we think is going on here is that these people have come in under this cloak of righteousness, you know, which we all have seen. You know, we've all seen stuff like this. We probably have our own stories about things like this. It looks like righteousness. And they have probably said, and you've heard it before in churches, those people, Paul is just saying things to tickle ears, to get converts. Like, we have the true message here. You know, like that, we've all heard that, you know, like that's, I always think it's interesting that it's always someone else that's trying to tickle ears. Like that's no matter what. And again, I'll stress this too. You're going to get a lot of Chris Escher commentary on this one, but you're going so in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, a lot of churches, like one of our big fighting points is like, we call it the worship wars type of thing. It's like, the two sides in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is you have the confessional side, which kind of tends to be the more what we call chancel prancing style of worship, and then you have like the missional side, which tends to be all the like contemporary songs and things like that. I think they're both wrong, and here's why. Because I'm the righteous one in the room. You know, they're both saying the same thing. They're saying, if you do this way, you will live. Like, God, you got to get out of that mentality. You know, you can't be like, if we can just do 5 and 15 correctly, then everything will be hunky dunky. You know, like everything will be great. You can't go, well, if we just had this style of music with a band and all these things, then finally the church would be righteous again. You know, like you can't do that, because all that does is create animosity between the churches and between the memberships. Like there's got to be a better way, you know, and I think that's kind of what Paul is talking a little bit here. So I think people have come to the church and are like, oh, that Paul, he's just speaking to tickling ears. Grace is the easy way, you know, all that stuff. But we have the real thing, and he's like, and he says, I'll be a bondservant of Christ. That's not bondservant. That's cleaning it up. That says slave. You know, that's slave of Christ. Like Paul is saying, like, no, I'm a slave to the way of Christ. Like I'm not some using Jesus to make my name great. And then we begin to he begins to explain what it means for him to be a slave of Christ, a bondservant of Christ, a servant of Christ. And he goes, so verse 11, but I make known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. So he's continuing to define that. I'm just not making this stuff up. For I neither received it from a man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. So he's saying, like, I didn't get this because I was an apostle of Peter or a disciple of Peter. I didn't get this because I was a disciple of James or, you know, any of these other guys. I didn't get it because it was handed down, but I got it through the revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, that means a couple of different things, but it means a big one. What's the big one? When he says he got it from the revelation of Jesus Christ, what's he talking about?
I got it directly from God.
Like the road to Damascus.
Yeah.
Jesus changed his mind.
Yeah, the Damascus road experience. And that's what the rest of this is about. Like coming down through here. Like, so he's suddenly, everyone in that congregation would have known exactly what he was saying as soon as he said it. He's like, oh, he's talking about this conversion experience. And because we remember his conversion experience, and I have the first little bit here in Acts chapter 9. It says, meanwhile, Saul, I have it here. I don't remember the exact verse I wanted to read there, but we know that story where he was walking down and that Paul had all of his faith. And this is what we got to understand about Paul. And this is what one of the things I get most frustrated by churches, is that Paul's understanding of how to live a righteous life was 100% bound up in the law, both in the law that we understand of Judaism, but in the law of how he understood how to practice Judaism. So much so that he thought it was righteous to exterminate people that were going with the grace, right? So much so that he thought it was righteous to do that. That's how much faith he had in the law, both of the law of Judaism and the law of you have to practice it this way. Now that's who Paul was. And then something happened to him, which we're going to read about. There's something happened to him, that revelation of Jesus to Paul on the road to Damascus, that caused him to arrest and go, no, it's this grace in Christ. Like, we cannot forget that Paul had so much faith in practicing the law, and for him to go the opposite way for that, it's a total 180. And everyone's familiar with the Damascus Road experience of Paul, right? You're familiar with it? A little bit. All right. So let's go over the Damascus Road experience. So Acts. What's going on in Acts is you have the Gospel of Luke, which I titled. We did a sermon series on the Gospel of Luke. We called it the Jesus Experience, and then Acts is basically Luke 2. Okay, it's Luke 2, and I called it the Spirit Experience. You could really call it the church experience, because what we end up seeing in Luke is you see the way of the Messiah, which the way of the Messiah is one that is of rejection. The Christmas story in Luke, I talked about it on Sunday. Christmas story in Luke has the shepherds in it, a rejected people that are there for the birth of the Messiah. And it's of rejection. Remember, he's rejected by his own people. He's rejected on the cross, but of resurrection after that. And Acts, then you have the church who has to flee to different parts because of rejection. And we end up seeing Paul goes through a crucifixion moment, but it's not because Paul is inherently special. Paul is representative of the church. And Paul, on his way, he's arrested and sent to Rome. He's in the shipwreck, which is like a crucifixion narrative. And in that, he's able to raise a young boy from the dead and all this stuff. It's a whole resurrection experience too. In Acts, in chapter 9 of Acts, you have Saul, which here's the first verse of chapter 9 of Acts. Meanwhile, Saul still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. So he is trying to murder all these people. And he's on his way to Damascus, and suddenly Jesus just appears in front of him. Jesus appears in front of him and kind of causes him to kind of go blind. He's got these things that he ends up calling scales on his eyes, and he kind of goes blind. And then he basically kind of admits that Jesus is the true Messiah, the true King that he was trying to persecute. Jesus says to him, it's like, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Saul and Paul is the same person. Saul is just the Hebrew way of putting it. Paul is the Greek way of putting it. Okay. So Saul and Paul is the same name. So it's confusing that they don't explain that. And so he has this great grand conversion experience. You have room. You're fine. You got plenty of room here. You just got to move everything out of the way first. So we have that Damascus Road experience through Paul. Now, what's interesting in the book of Acts is that right after Paul's conversion, the Damascus Road experience, you have the stories about Peter's conversion. And Peter's conversion is like the story of Cornelius and all of that, where Peter has this dream where the Lord shows him, is like, eat all this. And there's all these cloven animals and pigs and bacon and all that stuff. And Peter comes to the realization, and that is like, was it chapter 11? No, that's chapter 10. And Peter realizes that he goes over to Cornelius' house, which is a Roman guy. And that's when Peter realizes that, it wasn't about the bacon. It wasn't about the pigs. It wasn't about all that it was about that God was saving these Gentiles too. Okay. So you see Acts and the story that it's telling. You have the murderous threats of Saul and Paul. And then you have And then you have Peter, so you have the two pillars of the early church. They're both have had conversion experiences. Even though Peter's already converted and all that stuff, you could see that he's converting over to the full grace of Christ. That's what Acts is doing. So let's continue reading here and stop me if anyone wants to say anything. We'll continue reading here in Galatians. So we ended with verse 12 with the revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former conduct in Judaism. See, he's talking about it. How I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And he explains why he did that. And I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation. He's basically saying, like, I was it. I was the man. I knew more than anybody. Right? Like that. I knew more than anything. And he says, and then he says this, and I think this has become one of my big rallying cries now. So he goes, beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers. What do the other translations say there? That being more exceedingly zealous.
Ancestors.
It uses zealous.
Yeah, zealous.
Good.
Tradition, that's a key word.
Yeah. That's so Acts does the same thing. And this is what I didn't realize this in the book of Acts. And Luke is kind of doing the same thing too, because it's like it goes back to the shepherds in the Christmas story. It's the rejected ones that are kind of the ones that are the righteous ones in Luke. But that's also the fact in Acts. And that many of the church's problems, and many of the problems with the Pharisees and the religious leaders in Acts is that they're zealous. They're zealous for a way, right? They're zealous for a way. And I think it's interesting that Paul uses that same terms. That's really what I walked away when we did that sermon series in Acts. What was that, 4 years ago now? That I walked away, I was like, oh, this is about zealousy. And here's what's wild, is I was always taught growing up that zealousy was righteousness, right? Like that was, that it's like, be zealous for the Lord. Be zealous for the Lord. But there's a problem with that.
Yeah.
Because I think zealousy can often blind us, and we begin to call what we want the Lord, and we become zealous for it. So listen, and here's how I define that. We will say something like, well, the Bible clearly says. Well, does it? Or is just, do you think your reading of the Bible clearly say? Like that's, and then what happens is we're like, well, this is my reading of it. And we're like, this is what God says. And we go 100% on zealousy on it. And we're saying it's God, but it's actually us.
It's our interpretation.
And that's difficult. I don't know if that makes sense, but that was I heard someone about a month ago talking about that. I was like, oh my gosh, that's it. And because if you look at the scriptures, it's always pointing us to people like the shepherds, pointing to people like Jesus that was rejected, and Jesus was so zealous for everyone else that he died. He wasn't zealous for doing the right thing. Like that's and the shepherds were the ones that were there, wasn't the ones that were zealous for righteousness. Like that's, and so you look at Paul and he's like, I was zealous for these traditions. I was zealous for Judaism. I was zealous for the law, like that's, and I think we can often get zealous for like, well, this is how I want it, and we can go on the war path then when we get that way. And we become zealous just for ourselves. I think in those things. Let's see. So then continuing on, but when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace. Let me read 16 too, but that's a fascinating phrase there. And I'm not quite sure what it means, so we'll talk about it. Verse 16 as well, to reveal his son to me that I might preach him amongst the Gentiles. I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood. All right. So verse 15 again, but when it pleased God, so he's talking about how zealous he was, but when it pleased God, notice his language. It's not when Paul was like, well, I finally read the right book. I finally came to that pastor's Bible study, which is good. You guys are, right? But when it pleased God, like, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace. What is he talking about? Separated me from my mother's womb. What do you guys think he's talking about? What do the other translations say? Do they say basically the same thing?
Before
Before I was born.
Right.
Let's look at the.
Set me apart
before I was born, and called me through his grace.
All right, Lee, I'll actually share this. I'll share this with you this time. I'm not going to share the sound with you then. All right. So let's see. What verse is that? 18. Let's see here. Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
15.
Oh, 15. 15.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, Ed,
I went through
leading me astray.
16 is.
So it's whatever pleased God. Yeah, too zealous for the numbers, right? Having selected me from the womb of my mother, basically, and having called me by the grace. So we see like it's like separated me from my mother's womb. That's so from born is a good translation because it's not as weird as separated from my mother's womb. But I think there's some work that we could do. What's he talking about? Who separated me from my mother's womb? Yeah.
If I can read the notes that they have for 115 here.
Okay.
It said, Paul did not decide to change religion. As God set apart and called the prophets of old, so also he chose Paul to bring the gospel to the Gentiles in keeping with his divine purpose. Paul, the former persecutor of the church, knew from experience that God called him by grace.
Yeah. That's really. I mean, we're seeing that is definitely how he looked at it there, and so why did he write? He separated me from my mother's womb. Why do you think that's there? It's an odd phrase. I have an idea. That's why I didn't stick it.
That this was supposed to happen. In other words, that God knew what he would do and that God would change him.
I think it's Paul's way of saying that I was so connected to my zealousy of hurting other people for righteousness' sake that it was connected to me all the way in, like through who I was, through my mother's womb, through my father, all the way back into Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all that stuff. And is he saying that God separated him from that? He saw that wasn't what it was about. And it's also a clever way of talking about what you just talked about, was saying that he was being sent out to the Gentiles as well. That it's like this familial connection that he was separated from, almost. I don't know. Like it made me. I was like, that's odd wording.
When you hear the expression "I was born for it,"
it
comes from something like that.
Yeah. It could be something like that too. And so like that's and that. So there's like two things that we've said so far that this could be, that Paul is saying that one is that it's kind of separated from this familial connection to Judaism. And then what Gloria just said, it could be one that he said that like, this was my original intent, that this is why I was separated from my mother's womb.
Away from tradition.
Yeah. So like that. So it's an odd
Yeah.
colloquialism type of thing, and it can mean a couple different things. And so it's fun to break that stuff down. Let's see. So and he called me through his grace. So he uses that grace word again, you know, and I think you can understand what he's saying is that he's like, if it was all based on the law, I shouldn't have ever established a church because I was disgusting and gross. That's Chris Escher word terminology for it. But you can kind of see what he's talking about there. You know, like I was the chief sinner type of thing. I should have never been able to do this if it really was based on the law, but he called me through his grace. And so therefore I did that. And so verse 16, to reveal his son to me that I might preach him amongst the Gentiles. So like that's completely like changing him up. And he is going to the Gentiles now. I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Now that little bit there, I did not confer with flesh and blood, nor go up to Jerusalem or the apostles before me, but I went to Arabia. Do you have any idea what he's talking about there?
Sounds to me like he's saying, I'm not going back to the old laws.
Yeah.
This isn't grace, or this isn't the old laws. This is grace. This is a whole nother.
Yeah. Yeah. So like he didn't just go back to his family, you know,
Going back there.
I didn't even go back to the apostles. Like, and so he's still building upon the idea that it's, that he was called by Christ, not, you know, like over there.
Christ's word is not influenced by anyone else.
Yeah. And so, which is kind of a weird power trip, but that's all right. That's all right.
I don't think it's a power trip.
Yeah. No, I don't think it is either, but I'm just being.
He was so absorbed is the best word. He was so invigorated, changed. It like you said before, he was Jewish down to the soul. At this point, he became Christian down to the soul. There was no need to consult. He knew what he had to do. It was like breathing to him.
Yeah. And you could, that's a good way of putting it, like the breathing. I think it's a good connection to that mother's womb thing too. And you could tell that he's like, so it's the grace of Christ, and then he would preach amongst the Gentiles, you know, so like he's being sent out. Yeah. And so, and I had to look this up, and I thought it was interesting when he talked about needing to go to Arabia. And that's what the other translations say too. Arabia. Does anyone else say anything besides that? What that probably means is that he went to Sinai. So that's where Sinai would have been. And so it was like a pilgrimage almost to the Lord's mountain type of thing. Like because it's interesting. Like the biggest thing also when we're going through Acts is, and I make jokes about this in the sermons all the time, but like that, I think we think that Paul was in prison for like 3 days here, 6 days here, yeah, you know, all that stuff, and then like, you know, and he was in prison for years, you know, and so when we get these little minor setbacks, I always think that's, you know, kind of funny. And also his time after the revelation of the Lord to him on the Damascus Road it was years afterwards before he starts doing all that. You know, it wasn't before he starts preaching and stuff like that. It's not like, oh, I saw Jesus, and 3 days later, he's like, let's start this preaching and stuff like that. And he talks about that here in Galatians. He's like, I didn't go back over there. I went to Sinai. You know, and so that's what I looked that up, is that was a call name for like that region around Sinai. And so you can almost see what he's doing is he's then connecting his journey now to the journey of the Hebrew people. walking through Sinai, when they became who they are, and when they were having to rely not on the law, that's when they got the law, but not rely on that, but rely on the Spirit leading them by fire by night and clouds by day, right? And so then he says, I return to Damascus.
It makes me think that he went there to get his new footing,
Yeah.
Okay.
to kind of walk in that path.
Mm-hmm. And what I think is interesting, as Western Christians, this is so opposite to everything we understand, and all these things. But this has, I was actually listening, and some of you are probably going to think this is like straight heresy, and that's okay. I was listening to a podcast the other day about this. It was a Christian guy who grew up in the Navajo Nation, I think, and he really was talking a lot about, and I think he was talking about all this stuff with Paul during this time, and connecting it to what did the Navajo Nation call it, like a walkabout or something like that when you got older. And he says, like, we never think about stuff like that, but he says that there is you see Jesus going out into the wilderness. You have the children of Israel going out into the wilderness. You have all these things, and there's like there's almost like going to the mountain. And that there's this that it is, we kind of poo-poo it, but it actually may be like a good formative time, and it kind of just made me think of that, like reading that there. Yeah.
I'm looking at, I've got a commentary here on my phone, and it says about the Arabia and Damascus. It says, instead, without any further command and commission from Jerusalem, he made a journey to Arabia, in whose deserts he was shut off entirely from all intercourse with the brethren, but on the other hand had plenty of opportunity for solitary communion with God. And then it says, at the close of this sojourn, of which we have no other information, Paul returned to Damascus, where he resumed his activities and was forced to flee from the city on account of the hatred of the Jews. So this kind of sounds like he was going back to the people who had rejected him first.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah. And when you were reading that too, it made me also think about, and we're kind of out of time, but it made me also think about like how Acts treats Paul, and that it treats him as like an example of the church in general. And so you see God's people in the Old Testament go into the wilderness. You see Jesus going into the wilderness. And then like when you connect these stories together, you see Paul even going into the wilderness, type of thing like that. And so, so I think our little nugget for today, as we go deeper into the grace of Christ, and if you have to spend some time in the wilderness, whether that's through like a stage of doubting or a stage of renewal, a stage of, where you're just like, oh, I feel kind of aimless and stuff like that, that might be good, where you're kind of learning more to rest in the grace of Christ rather than, leaning on your own understanding type of thing. And so that's I can't say definitively I'm coming up with that off the spot here, but that might be an interesting time, an interesting way to look at it. And so so I think thanks for reading that, because that's kind of allowed that connection, and you can kind of see that story kind of interplaying out as we go through here.
I think it pulls you into more prayer.
Yeah.
When you're called to an isolated place like that.
Yeah.
Sometimes in the middle of the night,
Yeah.
Powerful need to pray.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, and there's just a lot of times in life where you can just be like, I don't know what I'm doing right now, And so, and sometimes those can be really glorified. Sometimes it's never fun. Like I don't want to put too much righteousness on it, but good deal. It's good. We'll end right there. This next little section in chapter 1 is really connected to the next section too. And so we're kind of establishing all of this, and man, I may have to speed up a little bit. We'll see. That's
Only 6 chapters.
It's only 6 chapters. It's only 6.
We made it almost through chapter 1.
Yeah. So, but thanks for coming and all of that stuff. Let me sign off to thanks for watching on the old YouTubes.